All right. Well, I'd love to introduce a friend of mine, Kathy Johnson. She just defended her doctoral dissertation, and I'll let her introduce herself and her context and tell a little bit about what she did in her work on her dissertation. But before that, just to let you know, she has done a lot of work preaching and gathering digitally for a while now, and so I think she offers some insight as to some good practices and what that looks like. So, Kathy, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Levi. Yeah, my name is Pastor Kathi Johnson, and I am an associate pastor at Zion Lutheran Church in the northwestern part of San Antonio, Texas. I've been at Zion now for just over a year and a half, and so just to sort of root myself a little bit in my ministry at Zion, part of my portfolio there is in social media and communications as well, and as well as working with our Stephen ministry, which is very active at Zion, and also worship planning. And so this whole what to do during this time of COVID-19 has really impacted my portfolio quite profoundly between trying to figure out what are we going to do for worship, and then how do we throw all that online, and how do we communicate about it all. It's just been kind of a madhouse the last few weeks. As you said, I did just defend my thesis, and my project for all 3 years was a venture called Digital Gathering. You can go to my website, digitalgathering.org. I function quite a bit on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/diggather. And recently, actually just as of January, started a YouTube channel. And so you can go to YouTube and search Digital Gathering, and I'll come up there as well for anybody who wants to check any of that out.
Yeah, definitely. So as you mentioned, we are kind of in a new space for many of us that have been acclimated to preaching to a live congregation, and now we are trying to figure out what it means to preach in a context that is mostly digital, or if it has any sort of live interaction in that moment, it's facilitated digitally. And so would love to hear what your experience has been in leading those kinds of worship moments, and maybe some practical tools that we could utilize, or some practical wisdom in how to preach in those kinds of moments that maybe we haven't necessarily thought through before.
Sure. Well, some of what I've observed, and I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, because I feel like we're all just kind of doing the best we can right now, trying to keep our heads above water with all of this. Just some very simple things. And I had to work out this on Digital Gathering as well. With things like camera angles even, and things like that. I am actually going to take some time either later today or tomorrow, and I'm going to rearrange the space that I'm in. This has not been one that I've been using for Zoom or Digital Gathering or anything like that until really the last week. And so I'm breaking one of my own rules, which is I've got the backlighting behind me. And I see a lot of my colleagues doing that. And it's worse. This window is worse in the morning. So just paying attention to some of those types of things really can make a big difference on how the video is received. Another thing that I see a lot of my colleagues do that I try and discourage is, or encourage, I should say, is to think about camera angles. Nobody wants to look up your nostrils. And so if your laptop is down, or your device is down low, and we're looking up, your chin and your nostrils, it's not super helpful maybe for the proclamation of the gospel. And so you'll see sometimes, it's funny, people posting pictures of their setup. And so for right now, I have my laptop up on just one book. Sometimes though, it'll be 2 or 3 books, depending on sort of the level of the desk I'm sitting at, or the chair, or whatever. All of those things that seem kind of maybe silly or trivial, but really they do contribute or take away from what message we're trying to proclaim.
So in a sort of thinking about whether you're having to preach from home, or if you're preaching maybe still within a sanctuary, but obviously limited staff or something like that, so what would you say in terms of like framing, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
The camera has a particular space that it can observe.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say would be important in terms of framing the pastor or whoever's preaching, so that whoever's watching that moment would be able to relate in the best kinds of ways, or to really be able to, for instance, see features about the pastor that's preaching. So like in this moment, you can't really see my hands. So how important is it for someone to be able to see, a wider angle, or, that kind of stuff? What would you suggest?
Yeah. One thing that I had to really, really, really work on with digital gathering was preaching to the camera that's up at the top on my laptop. It's up at the top of the screen. So I'm actually looking at that right now rather than looking at your face, Levi, which goes against my instinct, right? I'm as a communal person, I want to look at you and I want to see your face and your expressions. And a conversation is different too than preaching, but I've just gotten so used to looking at the little round thing at the top there. That really makes a difference though too, looking there versus looking there. It's much more, you use the word relational, it's much more relational to look, to have the preacher or, presider, whoever's leading, looking at the camera as opposed to not. So at Zion, one of the things that we're doing right now is we have a camera set up. We have a small tech team that's working. I'm going to say something, and I'm not trying to sound snotty at all, but we are very blessed in that the person that we have running our camera, she actually does some camera work for ESPN. so she knows, she knows what she's doing big time. And so when she is shooting, of course, it's much further away. She's shooting us, I would say probably, we're behind a pulpit. We're able though to express our arms, and she catches that on camera. So like if I throw my arms out wide, that whole gesture is on camera. If you're doing something like this, which by the way, this angle that you and I are using right now, this is not unlike what I use for digital gathering. So digital gathering is much more, I've heard the word intimate used, it feels more intimate. The gestures have to then, be pulled into that frame. And so any gesticulating that I do, it's a very small, really box that I do a lot of this with my hands. I have to keep it closer in and tighter in, and you just sort of have to get used to doing that. And it's hard. The first few times I preached to a camera and there's nobody else in the room, it felt really, really awkward until I realized that people are listening, people are paying attention. Even if it's being recorded and shown later, there's somebody on the other side of that lens that God is calling for you to speak to. And even if it's not exactly in that moment that the words are coming out of your mouth, you're still speaking a word to somebody from the Lord. And that's what really helps me when I'm thinking about preaching to this little tiny circle that's on my computer.
So in terms of that, then, are you thinking about particular people in your context, your congregation, or that are connected to the digital gathering, for instance, and thinking about their stories in the moment? What is it that you help to sort of move past the technology gap and think about the persons that you're maybe preaching to or with?
Sometimes I have thought of that, like if I'm aware that there's a member that's going through something, and just like we all do as pastors, right? When we're preaching, we don't obviously name things too specifically in our sermons, but
Sure.
maybe we think about a situation that we know, a person or a family is going through. Not all of my members watch digital gathering, and so I guess for me, and of course, there's so many more people in so many different circumstances that watch digital gathering than just my congregation. So I can't possibly know all of those needs. What I actually addressed in my thesis about that was talking about, though, how there are people in my congregation that are going through things that are probably pretty common, among other people in the world. And so health concerns, obviously, or maybe a grief that they've just lost a loved one or whatever. and thinking about those things sort of in a more global way, rather than thinking about, this family in my congregation, trying to think about how can I maybe take this grief that I know about that's going on in my congregation, and speak on a more global level about that. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but that's sort of where my brain went with that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's helpful. So there's a few times where I've seen things that preachers, pastors have posted, and as I'm listening or watching, I'm just thinking, oh, that probably shouldn't have been done, or that sort of distracts from what they're trying to do, or even contradicts what they're trying to do. So I'm just curious, out of maybe things you've observed or learned during your time as a pastor who's used digital technology and all that kind of stuff. Are there certain things that you would just say are either faux pas or no-nos in terms of when you're preaching using technology?
Let me reframe that in a positive
Sure,
way.
that'd be great.
I like to think of it in terms of hospitality. And so welcoming people to a space digitally is not really that different than when we welcome people to our physical spaces. My mission statement for Digital Gathering is it's a place to explore through scripture, prayer, and reflection. And what I mean by saying that is people are going to come in, and some people are Christians, some people are not. Some people just want to hear, like, I have a friend who's an atheist, but she has followed the Digital Gathering stuff for several years now. And she says for her, it's sort of a way to kind of observe a different kind of Christianity than what she sees in a lot of the Christians who are around her in her life. And so if we think about it from a standpoint of hospitality and how do we welcome people to our digital spaces, and the idea of loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves really becomes more important even in digital ministry, because it's not about it. Let me say it a different way. It is about being welcoming and being loving. Digital gathering is unscripted largely, and so a lot of it, I mean, if I have a sermon that I've written for my congregation that I feel like is a good word for a digital congregation, then I'll share it on there. But a lot of it is just very extemporaneous, and I know there have been times when I've said something, oh gosh, I wish I could take it back, but one of the things that I heard from people as I started doing interviews and stuff for my thesis was that they appreciated that it was obviously a little bit more off the cuff and extemporaneous. A lot of people have more grace than we give them credit for. And they appreciate just that we're taking the time to maybe share another word with them, something that they can reflect on and take time to think about during their busy weeks.
So it doesn't necessarily have to always be a polished product, in other words.
Right. Well, one of the things that my advisor said very, very early on in my project, my doctoral project, was she said, you need to think about the sustainability of this as a working pastor. And, at the time when I started the DMIN program, I was a working pastor, solo pastor of a small, struggling congregation, very vibrant, in some ways, had a lot of really good things going on. But I mean, it was me and I was the staff by and large. And I couldn't draw upon other people really to help with, lights and sound and camera and all that. I had to just sort of do it. And part of the sustainability part of it for me was realizing that there are going to be times when the internet's going to just poop out. There's going to be times when the phone runs out of battery, or, I mean, whatever. And just sort of saying, you know what, that's the way it is. And trusting then that, another opportunity will come along and the right time and place.
I definitely appreciate that. I think there's something to be said for, especially during this moment where it feels like there's an increased workload because of a need for increased communication with our people. And then trying to, for some of us, learn new technology and pastoring in some different ways than, that are maybe perhaps unconventional for us. And so having some grace in the learning process and even in the sort of application of what we're learning, I think that's a good thing for us to hold on to.
Yeah.
So out of curiosity, you've talked about hospitality, which I think is a really great way of framing pastoral life in general, but the preaching moment certainly, and then, trying to preach through technology, which feels like there's a sort of distance between the preacher and the congregation or whoever's listening. And so I'm curious about ways that you try to sort of, close the gap, so to speak, especially relationally. So, whether that's in the actual preaching moment or beyond the moment when you're preaching. So, especially those that you're reaching through digital means, how do you create pastoral, care moments? What does that look like in a kind of a practical way for you?
One of the things that I had to get out of the habit of, a lot of times when I do digital gathering, it's on Sunday morning. I'll grab 15 minutes on Sunday morning and just knock it out. That sounds a lot more clinical than I mean it to, but I'm already kind of in church mode. And so I just sort of go and add it into my morning. But one of the things I had to get out of the habit of is okay, I start the live broadcast and I start off with the words, "Good morning." Because what I realized is there were people watching them throughout the week, and maybe they're watching at 9:35 p.m. And not that they can't get over somebody saying good morning at the beginning of a broadcast, but like, to me, that was one of those ways of maybe not recognizing that somebody might watch at 9:35 p.m. on a Thursday as opposed to 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Not everybody has that time on Sunday morning set aside for church or churchy stuff. And so again, that was a very simple thing of rather than saying good morning, it's just hello or, whatever greeting, but something really basic like that, to me sets the stage for those people who aren't necessarily with me live, but are catching it later, which is quite frankly, the bulk of my audience. There was another thing and it's out of my brain right now. Let me think for a second. I think, the other thing is just, and I alluded to this earlier, but our demeanor and how we present on camera. That's again where that whole camera angle thing and looking into the camera really makes a difference too, because I think that people feel more connected if you're looking at the camera. In fact, I've had people tell me that. I've had people, like, one of the parts of the digital gathering liturgy that I've put together is actual like prayer, intercessory prayer. And I don't look at the camera for that. I am my head's bowed and I'm praying. And it feels sort of weird. Again, the first time you do it, it's like sort of like the first time you pray with somebody over the phone and you're like, is this working? Is God hearing this? Like, it doesn't feel the same as when you're sitting, next to somebody and holding their hand or whatever. Of course God is hearing. I mean, right? This is the God we believe in and teach about. But I had somebody tell me one time, it would be more relational if you would look at the camera during the prayer. I'm like, well, but I'm not in that moment. I'm praying, I'm relating to God. I'm not necessarily trying to establish eye contact with somebody who's watching me on camera. So think about whatever you're doing on camera. And I would say just, the parts where you would naturally during a service look at your congregation, look at the camera during those parts. If there's a part where you naturally would maybe have your head bowed or you would have your head, like this or whatever, then do those actions as well. Because to me, that gives what we're doing a little bit more gravitas, and it doesn't feel so staged then. It's going to feel weird the first however long you do this. I mean, it's going to feel awkward. It's going to feel, uncomfortable or whatever. And you just sort of have to push through that to the part where you realize that people are appreciating the work that you're putting into it.
Another thought that I had in terms of pastoral care and concern, I think this is true in any preaching moment, but especially if you're broadcasting it in any sort of way. And you mentioned a little bit earlier, um, you know, how do you discern, or what sort of tips would you have for thinking through what you share, especially when it comes to personal stories or other, maybe congregants' stories, beyond asking permission? Is there an additional concern that this is being broadcast to a wider potential group of people beyond even the immediate church that might know that person, know the context, all that kind of stuff? So any tips for what that looks like?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the best person to ask about that, because I have posted some form of my sermons online for so long that I've had to think about that for the better part of a decade. Um, either the texts of my sermons have been online, or I did podcasts for a while where I recorded my sermons and posted them on a podcast. And so to me, that's something that comes so naturally. Obviously, if I share a story about a family member or a friend, I mean, it's all the stuff that hopefully we've learned already in homiletics classes, but get their permission, make sure that they're cool with, you talking about whatever. Um, I, um, I do change names if I have to, or, just eliminate a name altogether. There was one time I shared a really personal story about, it was about me at my mother's bedside when she was dying, and I didn't even think I could make it through that if I used the first person. And so I told it as a story, in the third person, as if I was talking about somebody else going through this experience. And it actually worked really, really well. And I preached that sermon online, but also in my congregation at Zion. And I had people tell me, or ask, and they were really uncertain if I was talking about myself or if that really was another person's story that I was sharing. So all those things that, hopefully, again, we've heard in homiletics classes of getting permission, changing names, shifting the focus of the story a little bit if that's appropriate. I have not done any checking into this, and with all of this nonsense going on, I probably won't anytime soon. But one thing that I've heard, and I have no idea if this is true or not, but I've heard that sermons become the intellectual property of the congregation, that they are not technically intellectual property of the person who has written and preached them. So legally, that can get into a little bit of, if a pastor wants to, for instance, publish or something like that. That would be something that I don't know then where that crosses over into, broadcasting a sermon. I need to check into that, and I want to check into it, but when and how? So that would be something else that might need some searching into.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Any other, just last things that you would say about preaching, especially in a sort of digital format, or through technology, whatever that looks like, that you would say this is really important for us to be considering, thinking through, especially in these moments where a lot of us are transitioning in to doing that in our current climate?
Yeah, you mentioned pastoral care earlier, and I never circled back around on that. So I really try to be really careful of if somebody comments on something that I've posted, like a sermon that I've posted online, especially like on Facebook, where people tend to get a little, wordsy or whatever in their comments. I really try to be careful in how I respond to those. I know myself, and I know that when I'm tired or hungry or both, that's not typically a good time for me to try and respond to any comment beyond just, hey, great job, Pastor, I loved it. I have every so often, I've had somebody come on and ask a really challenging question, or, something theological that just is not easy, or something that really, sometimes these conversations need to happen offline, and so maybe it needs a if it's somebody I know, I would never do this with somebody I don't know, but if it's somebody I have a relationship with, maybe it needs a private message or an email or a phone call, with that person. I would be really, really careful though about private messaging, taking conversations offline with people that you don't already have a relationship with, because that can be seen by some people as almost threatening, or it's not behavior that's really widely accepted online by everyone. It can seem a little creepy. So if you end up with a comment that of somebody that you don't from somebody you don't really know, that's challenging to sort of take on in that public way, I would say respond to it and try and kind of manage it in a kind and loving way if possible. Some people cannot be reasoned with, and you have the right. If you're posting it on your page, you control the content. If it's somebody that you don't know and somebody that you suspect even is maybe just trying to cause trouble, delete the comment. And, I don't have any compunction about that whatsoever. Sometimes it needs to be done. And that's not a hateful thing. Although some people would say that it is. I use a really extreme example. If somebody comments with something that is racist or anti-LGBTQ, I'm taking that comment down to protect any persons of color or members of the LGBTQ community that may come and see that hurtful comment that's been posted. It's a protection, for people who may come on and read the comment later.
Yeah. And so that becomes potentially even a hindrance from engaging in the video or whatever form you're using. That might be a sort of sign for some to not even engage.
Right. And I think sometimes we put stuff out there, and when we kind of forget about it, and we forget that we really have to curate what we're putting out there on our church Facebook pages or whatever. We have to really keep an eye on that stuff, again, for the protection of the community, for the good of the community. And it's not about necessarily avoiding difficult topics. It's just a realization that that having a dialogue for instance, in a string of Facebook comments is a really, really challenging thing to do in a way that's healthy and helpful. And sometimes for the good of everybody, it's best for all that just to get taken down.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. And thanks for taking some time to think through some of these questions that I know I've been wrestling with, and other pastors are trying to think through, sometimes on the fly. For many of us, we're jumping into uncharted waters. And so it's helpful to have some guides that have taken time to go through it before us. And so I really appreciate you doing that, Dr. Johnson. Thank you. I appreciate it. And blessings, to you and to all of your colleagues as well, all of our colleagues. And just go for it. It may be imperfect, but God uses the imperfect to reach people. Well, I definitely appreciate that. Thank you. Yep.